While you guys are having a seat, I want to thank you for being at Grace City today. Today is a busy day at the church, and I'm excited that you guys are here for the morning service. If you haven't heard, we got a big event tonight at 5 o'clock. We call it our Trunk or Treat. It's probably the biggest thing we do all year. We do it for the neighborhood. We do it for all of you. We do it for anybody in Jackson who's heard about the Trunk or Treat and wants to come hang out. I have a feeling tonight could be a really big event because the neighborhood had a few other events planned last night that got rained out. And so I think everybody is excited about coming tonight. And I hope that you'll join us. If you have a costume, put it on. Bring it on up. I guess I could say wear a family-friendly costume, but I really don't care. Just come on up. If it's not family-friendly, we'll just judge you. It'll be fine. And I still don't know what I'm wearing, so maybe I'll bring something not family-friendly. That'd be ironic, right? The pastor. But I hope you guys will come and be a part of that. It's going to be a lot of fun. At 5 o'clock, we got an outdoor movie. We got Trunk or Treat going on and all sorts of fun stuff. So if you know families with kids, definitely invite them. But if you don't have any kids, come on up and just have a good time with your church family as well. Today is also a big day because we're wrapping up a series that we started 3 weeks ago called Rethinking Fear. And we're looking at stories in the Bible of real people who face real situations that are scary, terrifying, in fact. And we're asking ourselves, what can we learn from these people? Where did they find courage? How were they able to make it through? What was it that was ultimately the result of that situation? How did it resolve itself, or how did they make it through that particular thing? And so today we're going to kind of put a bow on it with a story out of the Old Testament. And if you want to look it up, it's a long passage. We're going to make our way all the way through it, but it's going to start in Numbers chapter 13, starting in verse 1. And I'll provide a little bit of context for how we get there and kind of where we arrive. But 3 weeks ago, my good friend Willie Brown kicked off this series with a story from the Israelites after they had been released from Egyptian captivity, right? The plagues came, Pharaoh said, enough is enough. They've been released, and as they're making their way toward the promised land, they find themselves in a situation in which the Red Sea is directly on one side of them and an Egyptian army is bearing down the other side. The first scary situation that we looked at. And all these messages are on YouTube and our podcast, and I would strongly encourage you to go back and listen to that first one because Willie knocked it out of the park. But it was a great message just kind of to see what it's like when a group of people find themselves in a scary situation, and of course how Moses led them through that, and ultimately God showed up and split that sea so that they could cross. Well, today we kind of come back to that particular scene because the events that we read about today happened less than 2 years after that. We're still talking about the same group of people who were under Egyptian captivity. They were slaves of the Egyptian empire, if you will, and they had been released, and they're still making their way toward that land that God had promised them. All right? But because we're a little further away from that release from Egypt, they're close now to this promised land. About 2 years have passed, and they've spent most of this 2 years seeing God show up in mighty ways. Manna falling from heaven, pillar of fire at night, cloud during the day, the crossing of the Red Sea, all sorts of miraculous things that God had done, and yet they have found it more often than not the right time to groan and complain. That's just who they are. That's kind of what they're known for. Maybe you have somebody like that in your life. Like you just love being around that person because they groan and complain all the time. Well, the way you feel about those people is kind of the way God felt about the Israelites, because several times over these 2 years, he addresses Moses. He's like, Moses, listen, man, I've had enough of these people. Like, I want to be done with them. I made a promise. I'm good on my promise. But I promised the Israelites. I didn't promise these particular Israelites. So I'm thinking about just like wiping them out and kind of building a new nation back, and then you can lead that people into the promised land. And speaking of the promised land, this land that they were headed toward was really promised multiple times. There were several times that God had issued this promise. The first time he had issued this promise to this particular people, the nation of Israel, the Israelites, the Jews of the Old Testament, was in Genesis chapter 15. When he's talking to Abraham, the father of the nation of Israel. He says to Abraham, hey, Abraham, let me tell you about what's going to happen, and kind of gives him a peek into the future. Things that Abraham never personally experienced. He talked about how they'd be led and that they would be under captivity, that they would be subject to rule of a foreign land for about 400 years. And then ultimately God would let them go and free them from that. They'd make their way, and he describes there at the end of Genesis chapter 15 the geography of the place they're going to go and the people that they were going to go. In fact, he said specifically, you can look it up, at the end of Genesis 15, he said there are some people there named the Amorites, and the Amorites have not done right in my eyes, and so I'm actually going to use the Israelites to exact my judgment on the Amorites. That's going to be part of leading you into the promised land, this place I'm sending you, is that the Amorites are going to be judged. You're actually going to conquer them and take their land. Well, we repeated that promise in Exodus chapter 3 to Moses, right? Moses had fled from the capital of Egypt, because there's this whole scenario where he had committed murder and all sorts of things are happening, and he takes off, and God confronts him to ask him to be the leader of these people, and he does that using a burning bush. And as he talks to him out of this bush that's inflamed but not being consumed, he specifically says, there's a place that I have promised, a place that I am sending you. And again, he describes that place accurately, but the type of land it is, the geography of that land, and the people who are going to be there. And he says, I promise that your people will enter that land. That's the place that I've set aside for them. So we all know what the promise is. Everybody that's been traveling and groaning and complaining knows where they're headed, knows what God has promised about that, and yet they continue to test God's patience. So that's how we find ourselves in Numbers chapter 13. Starting in verse 1, you can read it with me. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses and said, send men to scout out the land of Canaan I am giving to the Israelites. Send one man who is a leader among them from each of their ancestral tribes. You know, there are 12 tribes, right? And so he says, I want you to find a leader, a man who's a leader from each one of those tribes, and they will be the spies. They will be the scouts of this land that you are going into. So Moses sent them from the wilderness of Paran, which is where they were, just south of the promised land, at the Lord's command. All the men were leaders in Israel. So these are prominent men from each one of these tribes, and they're so prominent, in fact, that they don't just get to serve as spies, but they also have their names included in the record of Scripture. So we start to read these names starting in verse 4. These were their names. Don't judge me. I have no idea how to say most of this stuff, all right? So you have Shemua, the son of Zakur, from the tribe of Reuben. That's the first guy. Then you have Shaphat, son of Hori, from the tribe of Simeon. You have Caleb. That's an important one. That's why I put it in a different color there. We'll come back to him. He's the son of Jephunneh from the tribe of Judah. We know the tribe of Judah. Igal, son of Joseph, from the tribe of Issachar. Hoshea, another important name, because he's going to change his name in a second, but Hoshea, the son of Nun, from the tribe of Ephraim. Palti, the son of Raphu, from the tribe of Benjamin. You've got Gadiel, son of Sodi, from the tribe of Zebulun. Gadi, the son of Susi, from the tribe of Manasseh, from the tribe of Joseph. If you can figure that out, let me know. Amiel, son of Gamali, from the tribe of Dan. You have Sethur, the son of Michael, from the tribe of Asher. And Nabi, the son of Vopshi, I think. That's not how you say that, okay? From the tribe of Naphtali. And Gul, from Makai, son of Makai, from the tribe of Gad. I told you this is a lot of fun. These 12 were the names of the men Moses sent to scout out the land. And look at what he did in verse 16. Moses renamed Hoshea, that's the one we read earlier, son of Nun. He named him Joshua. Now, we're probably familiar with Joshua because Joshua fought the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. And we know that he's this heroic figure in the Old Testament that God uses as a leader to ultimately lead this people into the promised land. But before Joshua was that person, he was Hoshea, the son of Nun. He was a leader in this tribe of Ephraim. And what is significant about Moses renaming Hoshea to Joshua is he actually changes the significance of his name. We've talked in great detail at this church about how the significance of a name, that the character of a person is found in their name, and it's a mark on them that is really impactful and significant and means a lot, symbolizes a lot to the people around them. So the word Hoshea, or the name Hoshea, means he that saves, or he saves, very simply. But Joshua means the Lord saves. And so what Moses has done is he's changed the name of one of the men who ultimately would become the leader of this people from he that saves, or the one that saves, to the Lord saves. And I don't think this is a subtle change, because I think what he's trying to acknowledge is that it's not going to be the strength of a man or the strength of our combined abilities that's going to save us or going to allow us to prevail, but rather the strength of the Lord that's going to do that. It is God who saves. It is God that rescued. It is God that will empower us to conquer the land and lead us into this place that he has promised. So we continue in verse 17. He starts to give instructions to these 12 men he's assembled. When Moses sent them to scout out the land of Canaan, he told them, he said, go up this way to the Negev, which is on the southern part of this land, then go up into the hill country, so head north from there. See what the land is like, and whether the people who live there are strong or weak, few or many. That's an interesting instruction we'll come back to in just a second. Is the land they live in good or bad? Are the cities they live in encampments or fortifications? Are there walls around them, or is this more like a tent city? Is the land fertile or unproductive? Are there trees in it or not? Be courageous. Bring back some of the fruit from the land. And then we get some context that it was the season for the first ripe grapes. All right, now, I mentioned before that there's something significant about that particular instruction. So as we go back here into verse 18, when he's asking them to scout and kind of give this recon mission and tell me what it's all about, he specifically says, I want you to take a look at the people. Because in Moses' mind, and I think in the mind of all those who are going, they were wondering, like, what are we up against here? But I believe there's also a danger in including this as an instruction, because the temptation is to measure our ability to conquer the people based on their size, based on their strength, based on their number. It was a dangerous question to ask because it opens the door to consider ourselves as the source of the power that it would take to prevail in this particular situation. As we continue in verse 21, so they went up and they scouted out the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rehob near the entrance to Hamath. They went up through the Negev, that's where they were supposed to go, and they came to Hebron. Hebron is significant. Hebron was where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were living. Now, why is Hebron significant? It's significant because Hebron is the place where the patriarchs were buried. That's what the Bible tells us. And the patriarchs are the family of men that Genesis tells the story of. So you have Abraham, his son Isaac, Isaac's son Jacob, Jacob's son Joseph. So you have this lineage, if you will, of patriarchs, these male family leaders that God worked through and used to lead the Israelites ultimately into Egypt as a rescue from the famine, but then obviously into captivity, and then of course he uses Moses to lead them out. But Hebron is the place where those patriarchs were buried, and it had been over 400 years since anybody from Israel had even seen this place, and yet it was significant and special to them because the fathers of their faith, the fathers of their nation, were buried there. And yet, as we read on, what we see is that they're more concerned about the size of the people there than they are the men who were buried and the promises that were made to those men. Hebron was built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt, so we provide some context for history. When they came to the Eshcol Valley, they cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes, which was carried on a pole by 2 men. I think this detail is included to go, you want to, like, this is how fertile it was. But it also might show you, like, how big the men are. If, like, the grapes had to be carried, like, one cluster was on one pole for 2 average-sized men to carry. You know, like, these men could just pick up a cluster and eat them. Like, it just reinforces the idea that what they were up against was giants in many ways, right? They also took some pomegranates and figs because who doesn't love those? That place was called Eshcol Valley because of the cluster of grapes that the Israelites cut there. At the end of the 40 days, they returned from scouting the land. So they spent 40 days, about 250 miles. They're checking it all out, right? And that number 40 is significant throughout the Bible, but it's most often associated with a period of testing, right? We remember back to The Devil Made Me Do It, and we talked about that in May. It was Jesus spending 40 days in the desert being tempted by Satan. That period of 40 days, of course, Noah, 40 days on the ark, things like that. The spies, we have this impression that the spies were being tested, that their faith and their confidence in the promises of God was being tested as they were scouting out the land. In verse 26, it continues. The men went back to Moses, Aaron, and the entire Israelite community in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They brought back a report for them and the whole community, and they showed them the fruit of the land, right? Check out these grapes. They reported to Moses, we went into the land where you sent us. So it said, hey, here's the good news. We went into the land where you sent us. Indeed, it is flowing with milk and honey. It's exactly what God promised Abram. It's exactly what God promised Moses. He used that phrase, flowing with milk and honey, at the burning bush. And here is some of its fruit. Check this out. However, and that's a word there that's important because however, also sometimes translated nevertheless, it's a strong statement that usually says, I'm about to contradict where you think this might be going. I've kind of set you up for something, but I'm going to take a left turn. It's like somebody saying, listen, last night you did a great job. However, and you're like, you don't want to hear however. You just want to hear a period. Last night you did a great job. Or last night you did a great job and, well, tell me more. You know, like heap on more praise. I love this. When you hear however, when you hear nevertheless, it's like, this is one of those like compliment sandwich kind of situations, you know? It's like, what's going on here? So they say, however, and of course that exactly is what it means here. The people living in the land are strong. Milk and honey, fruit, fertile, all that stuff. However, the people living in the land are strong. The cities are large and fortified. We're talking walls, Jericho. We also saw the descendants of Anak there. There they are again. Now, this phrase, descendants of Anak, this is actually the first place it's used in the Bible. a couple verses before. But there are references to the descendants of Enoch in other sources outside of the Holy Scriptures, specifically in some Egyptian texts taken from the 18th and 19th century BC. So we know that there's this idea that there are some giants or very large humans kind of roaming this particular area at this time. But listen to what they continue to say. The Amalekites are living in the land of the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and lo and behold, the Amorites. Who knew they would be there? I don't know, Abraham in Genesis chapter 15. I mean, it's like they look at this like it's a bad thing, and yet I look at it, and you and I look at it because we can judge, right, in 2022. Like, how is that not a sign that this is the place where God said, and that God was going to lead them there? God told Abraham, I'm going to use you to judge the Amorites, and they're going, golly, the Amorites are there. They live in the hill country. The Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan. And at this point in time, Caleb has kind of had enough, right? Because Caleb saw the situation differently. He said, he quiets the people because there's a buzz around, no doubt. People are getting worked up, like, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? In the presence of Moses, he says to everyone, let's go up right now. Let's take possession of the land because we can certainly conquer it. Now, this is an interesting phrase because there's actually more detail provided to this story in Deuteronomy chapter 1. You should go back and read that. Moses is retelling this story a little bit later, but he talks about how when he was leading them into this particular wilderness, this particular desert, this part here, his instructions were, let's just go right up into the promised land and take it. Like, we should not be fearful. We should be courageous. Let's just go do it. And it was actually the idea of the people he was leading to go scout it out first. Now, rather than say, no, listen, we're going to do it, he kind of relented, said, that doesn't sound like a bad idea. And then he goes to God, and God gives him the idea to select the leaders and the spies and all that kind of stuff, which is what happened in the story that we're reading today. But Moses originally in Deuteronomy 1:21 says, let's just go right into that. Be courageous. Do not fear. God is with us. Let's take possession of the land that God has chosen for us. And so what Caleb does is he basically repeats what he had already heard Moses say, but he also does something very difficult because he speaks against what the group is already thinking, right? He says, we should do it. Let's try and encourage to be faithful and to do what God has called us to. But the men who had gone up with him, these are the 10 spies who didn't see it the same way, says, we can't attack the people. They're stronger than we are. So they gave a negative report to the Israelites about the land that they had scouted. The land we passed through, the land we passed through to explore is one that devours its inhabitants. All the people we saw are men of great size. We even saw the Nephilim there. And the Nephilim were first talked about in Genesis chapter 6. They were trying to figure out what they were. A lot of people thought they were like this crossbreed of angels and men, and nobody could figure out how they got so big. But that's something that's been kind of a legend of the Israelites for a very long time. He says, we even saw them there. The descendants of the Enoch actually come from the Nephilim. They're just starting to make things up. To ourselves, we seem like grasshoppers, and we must have seemed like the same to them. And so what we see in specifically the verse right before this, one that devours its inhabitants, all the people are of great size, that wasn't actually true, right? Because the inhabitants who are living right there weren't being devoured. And all of the people they saw weren't giants. Maybe those that they considered the descendants of the Enoch were giants. But there were also the Amorites, the Amalekites, the Jebusites, all these others who were there. And so what we see here is something interesting that I think has a practical implication for us. What we see is that as they face a scary situation and they start to kind of be consumed with how scary it is, it only grows in how scary it is in their mind. They're so consumed with it, they begin to exaggerate how scary something is. I think the same thing happens to you or I when we got to get locked in on how scary something is. That there's a real danger in focusing too much on how fearful we are or how fearful a particular situation might be. It's right to recognize the situation for being scary, but to be so consumed with it we start to make it even bigger than it is a very difficult thing to overcome. And so as the story continues in chapter 14, the whole community breaks into loud cries. They're like, oh my gosh. And the people wept that night. All the Israelites complained about Moses and Aaron. They're like, these guys are fools. I can't believe we followed these leaders. The whole community told them, if only we had died in the land of Egypt, or if only we had died in the wilderness. Why is the Lord? They're questioning the Lord now. They're not just questioning Moses and Aaron. They're questioning the purposes and the plans of the Lord. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to die by the sword? Like, we could have died in Egypt, we could have died in the wilderness. Why now? Our wives and our children will become plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us to go back to Egypt? So they said to one another, let's appoint a leader and let's go back to Egypt. They're like, listen, Egypt wasn't perfect. We were worked all day, we were slaves, it wasn't a good thing, but we could eat there and we knew we weren't going to die by the sword. We were just going to die of hard work and old age. So I tell you what, let's just turn our back on God. Let's turn our back on God's leaders. Let's go pick a new leader and let's go back to that thing that wasn't good, but it sure isn't as scary as what we face right here, right now. And what we start to see is that this unbelief, the unbelief of these 10 spies who were nominated, who were picked among their tribes to go out and be scouts and spies, the unbelief starts to spread like an epidemic. Like an epidemic. And what we see here, unfortunately, I think is a real example of groupthink gone wrong. Right? This is kind of how groupthink works. It works in evil and destructive ways, specifically when we have a negative idea about something. You see this play out in our world in all sorts of different. There's nothing that rallies people together and gets them passionate more so than like a combined hate. Right? Like, as an Astros fan, I feel that personally, okay? Like, I get it. My team cheated in 2017. No one wants us to win the World Series right now. I get that, right? Everyone literally hates my team, right? And maybe that's applied to you at a particular time, like a hated rival, right? You hate your crosstown rival so much. It's like, I don't like this guy that's in class with me, but dadgummit, I hate that school even more. And so you're my friend because the enemy of my enemy is my friend, or whatever it might be. And we have this groupthink. And unfortunately, the way we see play out in this particular situation is that negativity that was sown by the seeds of these 10 spies starts to fester and starts to grow. And you have this groupthink that ultimately pins its ears back and says, we got to turn back. And this guy, Caleb, is full of it, right? But what we have in verse 5 is the response of Moses, Aaron, Caleb, and Joshua. Look what happens. Moses and Aaron fell face down in front of the whole assembly of the Israelite community. Moses and Aaron have been through this a bunch of times. They probably knew it was coming. They're like, God is about to bring the hammer down. Like, I have appealed to God multiple times on behalf of these people. He's probably done. We have tested his patience for a long time. I'm just bowing my head down. God, do what you do. I mean, like, I don't know exactly how that went down, but that's just kind of how I see it. Like, Moses and Aaron, like, Lord, just do what you will, okay? Like, I get it. I've tried, but you know how stubborn they are. They're bad. So they do that. But look at what Caleb and Joshua do. Caleb and Joshua don't just give up. They choose to do the hard thing. They choose to speak into it with truth, but a different perspective. They choose to speak against groupthink, which is always a very scary proposition. Joshua, the son of Nun, and Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, who were among those who scouted out the land, 2 of the 12, they tore their clothes, which is symbolic of their anger, their grief for what was going on, and they said to the entire Israelite community, listen to their plea, the land we passed through and explored is an extremely good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, he will bring us into this land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and he will give it to us. If the Lord is pleased with us, if we remain faithful, if we remain obedient, if we believe that what he says is in fact true, he will give us this land. Don't rebel against the Lord, and don't be afraid of the people of the land. We will devour them. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is now with us. Don't be afraid of them. They're pleading with them, like, don't complain, don't groan anymore. Like, don't be upset with God. Like, only trust in God. God has not failed us at this point. He's brought us to a situation that on its face looks terrifying, but he hasn't let us down. He's not given us any reason to doubt him. He's still with us. This is just going to be him showing up in maybe a bigger way than we've seen him do that before. And yet, of course, we see the response. While the whole community threatened to stone them, Caleb and Joshua, maybe not as good of a lawyer as you think they might be, right? I don't think it's reflective of their ability to convince or encourage or inspire. I think there's more of a reflection of just how far away from the confident faith in God the Israelites had become. I think the 10 spies were reflective of the 10 tribes who had become so without faith and without hope that they were ready to turn around and go back to an enemy in a sad situation where at least they knew they wouldn't die by the sword. While they continued to threaten to stone them, the glory of the Lord, this is what I love, the glory of the Lord appeared to all the Israelites at the tent of the meeting. What I love about this particular thing is like the Lord had had enough, but he intervenes right at the time that Joshua and Caleb were about to face stoning. He was like, it was almost a way of God showing incredible mercy and grace and protection to Caleb and Joshua for doing the right thing, for doing the obedient thing, for doing the faithful thing. We talked about this when the disciples were in the boat. The disciples that got on the boat with Jesus, that was in the storm that he ultimately calmed, were right exactly where Jesus had asked them to be. And just like the disciples in the boat, Caleb and Joshua were doing the very thing that God had called them to do, to be faithful, to encourage, to inspire. And when they were about to face stoning and maybe being stoned to death, God intervened. Now let me tell you how the rest of the story goes, because we got to wrap up here in just a second. God shows up, and the first thing he does is he talks directly to Moses. He says, Moses, that's it. I've had enough. I'm wiping my hands clean of this generation. I made a promise to the Israelites, not this bunch of fools. And so I'm just going to wipe them out. My promise is still good to you. My promise is still good to their descendants. The nation of Israel will inherit that particular land, but I'm done with them. I'm just going to wipe them out. And Moses appeals to God. God, I know. Believe me, I live with them every day. But imagine the glory that you're going to get if you lead them into the promised land. Remember what you said about being slow to anger and merciful and all of those things that you promised us that you were. Will you at least pardon them? Will you at least forgive them for their lack of faith and their disobedience? And God says, yes, I will. In fact, I will pardon them. But there is a consequence for their choice in this particular situation. And that consequence was that particular generation would not enter into the promised land. That ultimately those who had been led out of Egypt would not see the promised land, that land that God had promised to Abraham, to Moses, and to every Israelite up until that point. He said, so I need you to turn around, go back toward the Red Sea. You're about to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. They're going to die as they wander in the wilderness. They said they wanted to die in the wilderness. I'll let them die in the wilderness. But their kids, the next generation, they'll be the ones that are led into the promised land. But he also leveled some judgment on the spies. Because believing, there were two groups of spies, 2 that were faithful and obedient, 10 that were fearful and did not believe. And he leveled some judgment that we read about starting in verse 36. It says, so the men Moses sent to scout out the land and who returned and incited the entire community to complain about him by spreading a negative report about the land, those men who spread the negative report about the land were struck down by the Lord. A few verses before, we see it was actually a plague. They received a plague, they were out. Only Joshua, son of Nun, and Caleb, son of Jephunneh, remained alive of those men who went to scout out the land. We know that Joshua was the next leader that took the mantle from Moses and led them into the promised land. We know that Caleb continued to live. In fact, at 85, if you want to read in the book of Joshua, he says, I'm 85. I feel as strong as I did when I was 45. And he continued to get the inheritance that God gave him for being totally surrendered to him and a leader and willing to step up in the face of groupthink, in the face of all this negative talk, in the face of unbelief, and say the thing that needed to be said. 2 choices with 2 direct and different outcomes is what we see. And ultimately, I think, unfortunately, what we see in this particular passage is the great tragedy of unbelief. And what I mean by the great tragedy of unbelief is this: refusing to believe in God and his purposes prevents us from receiving his promises. Now remember, a couple weeks ago when we talked about God's purposes, plans and purposes are essentially the same to God, because whatever God plans to do, he can make happen. He has all the power to do it. So when he purposes something, it's the same way as saying God plans something. You and I don't plan and purpose the way God does. He can accomplish whatever he sets out to do. You and I, there's a lot of factors involved. So when God has purposes, and he set forth a promise that has a purpose or a plan, we can trust in that. And when we don't trust in that, unfortunately, we don't receive the promises. We have the same problem today. I think oftentimes we look back at stories like these and go, man, listen, if manna fell from the sky, if there was a pillar of fire at night, if God parted the Red Sea so I could cross, there's no possible way I wouldn't believe. And yet we have firsthand accounts of people that experience those very same things as actual participants in the story. And yet just 2 years later, they're ready to turn around and go back to Egypt. So I don't think it's miracles are the problem. I think this is a sin problem. I think this is a lack of perspective problem, a lack of faith problem, ultimately. The fact that we are not fully surrendered in trusting who God is, who he says he is, and what he says he would do, the way that Caleb did, the way that Elisha demonstrated for us last week. Oftentimes, I think, and I was told this growing up, that the greatest danger of unbelief is that you spend eternity in hell, right? You don't believe in Jesus, you spend eternity in hell. And listen, that motivates me to talk to people about Jesus, because I don't even want to imagine what that's like. And I'm thankful that I never have to experience that. But I would argue that something maybe just as scary is that the people who don't believe now have to live their life in this broken world without a relationship with God and the things that he wants to provide, his promises, his plans, his protection, his guidance, his forgiveness, his acceptance, His love, the purpose that comes along with knowing that the person who created you loves you and has called you according to his purposes to fulfill a part of a master plan and kingdom that he has brought about. You know, the great tragedy and unbelief is that we don't get to experience the things that are unlocked when our belief and surrender to God is activated. And so we started this series with kind of a series of prompts. The first was that fear prevents us from living the kind of life that God has intended. That's why we need courage, because it takes courage to face a scary situation and keep moving forward with confidence. Without courage, we're paralyzed or we're motivated to do a lot of the wrong things. Fear motivates us and leads us to do things many times we would not do if we weren't facing that same scary situation. But I believe the place we find that courage is a deeper faith in God. Right? So this isn't crossing out fear and just putting faith in its place. This isn't saying the way I fight fear is with faith. You fight fear with courage. But you find courage in faith and trust in God. And so a couple things that I want to make sure we have clear is that faith is not the absence of fear. Okay? It's not the removal of fear. All right? It's not fear going away. Faith and fear exist in the same part. Otherwise, you wouldn't need the faith. Faith is confidence in God and his purposes, that the things he's planned will happen. It's the reservoir from which we draw the courage needed to face fear and press on. We dive and dig into that trust so that we can find the courage to move forward in the face of a scary situation. And ultimately, I think faith allows us to think differently about the things that scare us, to rethink fear, and to see them as an opportunity for God's noticeable movement and his growth in our lives. Listen, I said this to the first service and I mean it. I do not wish for you to live a life free of fear. I don't. I do not wish for you a life that is free of situations that are going to scare the living daylights out of you. I actually want you to encounter some of those situations. And I want that for myself. The reason for that is that these situations provide opportunities for us to see God show up. This allows us to lean on God, to go back to God, say, God, I'm not sure I have enough faith for this. I'm not sure I'm strong enough to do this. I don't think I can see a way through this that turns out good. And God actually shows up and says, hey, watch this. And when he does, our faith grows. Our faith in him, we grow closer to him. Our trust continues to grow deeper and deeper because God continues to show up. And God works in us through that to help us become more like the person he has created us to be. And where does this faith come from? Well, I'm glad you asked, because if we look back over these 4 weeks, I think we find that the faith like this comes from the track record of what God has already done. It's on looking back and reflecting on the places where God has moved mountains and made a way when there was no way, and believing that he will, in fact, do it again. It comes from the knowledge that God is with us. For the disciples in the boat, they could have confidence and courage in the face of that storm because Jesus was on the boat. And God is with you and I. And so we know that whatever we face, we do not face alone. We can also find faith in the conviction that God's purposes for our life will be completed. Whatever God set out for your life to complete, that will be completed, because he doesn't plan and purpose in hope. He plans and purposes in confidence, knowing it will be fulfilled. When we find ourselves in the middle of God's will, walking in obedience, there is divine protection. Divine protection. And sometimes that protection looks like an upgrade from this broken world to the life in the world that is beyond. But there is divine protection in obedience and the will of God. It comes from the realization that the things we are unable to see, remember last week, those are the places that God has the enemy and our circumstances outnumbered and overwhelmed. That realm that we are unable to see, that's where God's at work, and he's always winning that battle. And this faith comes from a friend like Caleb, who sees our situation as an opportunity for God to show up and to show out. My prayer for you guys this week is that as you think about these 4 messages, and maybe just today, that you would find yourself a friend like Caleb. A friend that's not going to sugarcoat it. It's going to be honest about how he or she sees your situation. They're going to say, no, that's in fact scary. I get that. You're right to be scared. But they also love you enough to be honest with you. Maybe to remind you that, like, you got yourself into that. And maybe next time, before forgetting the advice you were given, you should listen when you ask me and what I tell you to. But also reminding you in the hard times that God has an opportunity to show up. And ultimately, a friend that believes more in you or more in God than he does in you. You need to find a friend who believes in the purposes of God for your life, maybe even more than you do. Listen, life is scary, and there's going to come a time where you feel like your only two options are to give up or to give in. And in a moment like that, you're going to need a friend like Caleb who sees things differently because their faith is ready to come aside and encourage and equip you and help you get through. And if you're not in a season like that right now, amazing. Maybe God is asking you to be that friend in the life of somebody else. Find a friend who will be honest, who will say the hard things, and will remind you that God is with you and for you. And giving up should never be an option. Will you pray with me? Heavenly Father, I thank you for this morning. I thank you for the way that Scripture encourages us, Father, to find courage in the face of fear, that we wouldn't be paralyzed, that we wouldn't be motivated or led to do the wrong things, dangerous things, disobedient things, God, but ultimately that we can grow our faith when we remind ourselves of the things you've done, of the places where you are at work, of your presence in our life. And we find friends like Caleb and Joshua who would encourage us in our moments of weakness. I thank you for your Son, Jesus Christ. I pray these things in his name. Amen.